Joseph Taborsky seemed to be on the path to negativity from the beginning. As at only 5 years old, he was stealing jewelry from a neighbor's house to give to his mother. At 7 years old, he was stealing bikes and committing several burglaries. By the time he was an adult, he met Arthur Culombe, a mentally challenged man who collected guns, and Joseph saw an opportunity in a gullible accomplice. But he would be in jail for murder during a robbery committed with his brother not long after, being sentenced to death. However, due to his brother's shaky confession being the only evidence against him, Joseph's charges were dropped and he was released from prison 5 years later. Now emboldened with his newfound freedom, he reconnected with Arthur, and the pair would leave an impact on the state of Connecticut that was still felt 50 years later. Welcome to History's Biggest Villains. Joseph Taborsky was a native of Hartford, Connecticut, born on March 23, 1924 to two Lithuanian immigrants, growing up on Hartford's North End as an eldest sibling with one brother and two sisters. His mother Mabel was a homemaker, and his father, a door-to-door salesman who was largely absent from his family, was mentally disabled. Joseph's father spent significant amounts of time in a mental hospital and played a negligible role in raising him. At the age of 5, Joseph committed his first crime when he stole jewelry from a neighbor's house and gave it to his mother. When he was 7, he stole a tricycle and carried out several burglaries. His mother later said that when he was a kid, he stole another bicycle in retaliation to his own bike getting stolen. He was charged with theft, receiving probation. Later, he escaped from a reformatory, and upon recapture, he was sentenced to an additional 3 to 5 years in custody. In the 1940s, he was sentenced to a period of imprisonment at the Wethersfield State Prison due to an escape attempt at a different prison in Cheshire, Connecticut. While at Wethersfield, Joseph was tasked with cleaning the death chamber in preparation for the triple execution of 3 convicted murderers in 1946. In 1948, he was sentenced to spend 18 months in prison for burglary, which he served across the country in the Washington State Penitentiary. As an adult, Joseph was known for having a prominent chin, described as a lantern jaw, which also earned him the nickname The Chin. When he wasn't in prison, he worked as a laborer and a truck driver. Arthur Joseph Meatball Culombe was a gun collector who was born in Fall River, Massachusetts on February 28, 1924. He was the same age as Joseph, but operated at the mental level of a 9-year-old, as he had an intellectual disability that made him unable to read or tell time. At some point while he still lived in Massachusetts, Arthur escaped from a mental hospital. On August 21, 1944, he took part in a robbery of 2 Hartford gas stations. He vandalized the properties, stealing wartime ration coupons and a tire. The next day, he participated in another holdup in Hartford, this time alongside 2 accomplices, but police found the stolen tire on the trio's getaway car. A jury convicted him of his involvement in the holdups and sentenced him to an indeterminate term in the Connecticut State Reformatory. Joseph met Arthur in 1948 while the two worked at a cargo dispatch facility in East Hartford. Authorities believed that Arthur's disability made him impressionable to Joseph's influence. The pair began committing burglaries together until Joseph crossed the line. On March 23, 1950, which is his 26th birthday, Joseph and his younger brother Albert, who were part of a 5-man robbery ring, were driving around looking for their next target. They stumbled upon Lewis Wolfson's liquor store in West Hartford. Albert waited in the car while Joseph walked in. During the robbery, Lewis was shot in the face and fell unconscious. Joseph then ran back to the car yelling, "The guy jumped me. Hurry up and get out of here." Wolfson's sister discovered him a few minutes later, and he was quickly taken to a hospital, being listed in critical condition. Despite his severe injuries, Lewis regained consciousness several times over the next 3 days and provided police with a description of the shooter, who he said was light-haired, baby-faced, and of average height, before he died from his injuries. The murder went unsolved for 10 months until Albert abruptly turned himself in, confessing to the murder and naming his older brother as the accomplice. He confessed to driving the car that night on a robbery spree that ended at Wolfson's store. He insisted that Joseph had fired the fatal shot, and his share of the holdup money was $32. Joseph was arrested on January 19, 1951, being convicted of Wolfson's murder on June 7th, after the jury deliberated for 9 hours. Albert, who was convicted of second-degree murder in a later trial, was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Joseph was sentenced to death on a first-degree murder conviction. While Joseph was on death row, he continued to maintain his innocence. In July 1951, Albert had a mental breakdown, claiming that he was Christ. This led to his transfer to his prison's mental health unit, then to Norwich State Hospital. In 1955, newspapers reported that Albert was declared incurably insane. Following Albert's mental breakdown, some publications referred to the murder as the Cain and Abel case, based on the nature of Albert's testimony landing his brother on death row. In an interview with Connecticut crime reporter Gerald J. DeMusi, Joseph expressed that he supported capital punishment and the swift handling of death sentences to reduce the mental anguish that death row inmates experience from waiting to die. He then portrayed his brother Albert as jealous, dishonest, and seeking revenge by framing him for murder. Joseph and his attorneys requested a new trial, arguing that Albert wasn't a reliable witness due to his mental state. Because his confession was the primary evidence used to build a case against him, the courts ultimately ruled in Joseph's favor, agreeing that the evidence prosecutors used to justify his conviction, death sentence, and continued imprisonment was insufficient. In late July 1955, after spending 52 months on death row, he was granted a new trial. In early October, prosecutors announced that they would drop charges against Joseph entirely and nullify his previous conviction due to lack of evidence, as the courts considered Albert's testimony to be too legally dubious to use in a second trial. As a result, Joseph was a free man on October 6, 1955. Prior to his release, Joseph said in an interview, "How can such great injustice be done to the innocent? If you can only realize the feeling of helplessness I had, it hurts me especially to see my mother suffer." He also said that the first thing he would do upon his release would be to stay in a monastery in New York to recover from his stay in death row, which he called an inhumane ordeal. When a crowd of reporters met him outside the prison and asked him for further comment, he committed himself to living a crime-free life. "You can't beat the law. From now on, I'm not even going to get a parking ticket." Less than a year after his release, Joseph moved from Hartford to Brooklyn, New York, although he visited frequently to see his mother. He also married a woman who wrote him letters while he was on death row. But not long afterwards, Joseph was unhappy with his marriage and unable to find steady work, so he went back to committing armed robberies in September 1956, reuniting with Culombe in December with the intent of committing more crimes together. The pair started with a string of robberies in Hartford and Rocky Hill, Connecticut. In the robbery of a hotel in December 1956, the clerk escaped from the two without incurring injuries. But during another liquor store robbery in Hartford just a few days later, the owner, Jack Rosen, was pistol whipped, requiring several stitches. In the robbery of Silas Dean Package Store in Rocky Hill on December 11th, Peter Barone, the store's owner, was pistol whipped by both men in the head and robbed of at least $100. On December 15th, the pair shot Taylor Nicola Leone in the face during a robbery of his shop. The bullet lodged in his neck, but he survived and later provided a description of his attackers, telling authorities the man who shot him wore a red polka-dotted handkerchief over his face. Leone spent a week in the hospital, and after his release, police stationed units by his home for security purposes, and he closed his store because he needed time to recover. Only 1 hour after the attempted murder, the pair drove in Arthur's Oldsmobile to Kurp's, a gas and service station in New Britain, Connecticut, with the intent to rob it, of course. The owner of the station, 30-year-old Edward J. Kurpiewski, serviced the car while Joseph got out to use the bathroom, and Arthur paid for gas. After giving him the money, Arthur held him at gunpoint and ordered him into the gas station's boiler room. He was then shot with a .32 caliber Russian-style revolver and robbed of his wallet, while Joseph searched for money in the main office. As the pair took money from the cash register, Daniel J. Janowski, a 30-year-old prospective customer, drove up to the gas station with his infant daughter and stopped by the gas pumps. The robbers waited inside the building for him to leave, but he didn't. They then got out and approached Daniel's car, with Arthur pretending to fill the car up for some time before he was held at gunpoint and robbed of his wallet. The two then ordered Daniel to enter the station's bathroom, where Joseph shot him twice in the head. Afterwards, the two drove to Arthur's house, divided the money, and threw the revolver in the shallow pond, after which Joseph returned to his home in Brooklyn. Both of the victims died as a result of their wounds. An hour after the pair left, a bus driver discovered Janowski's daughter still sitting in his abandoned car. The two criminals noticed her in the car, but chose to leave her unharmed because they felt she was too young to implicate them. Police later found that the robbers left $133 in the cash register. Days after the murders of Kurpiewski and Janowski, Governor Abraham Ribakoff offered a $3,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the perpetrators. The Connecticut State Police also entered the investigation around December 19th. At the time, authorities believed Leone's shooting was connected to the murders, and later tested that bullet against the bullets used in the previous crimes. Also following the double murders, Connecticut State Police organized a special force of investigators tasked with working the now dubbed Mad Dog murders. Initially, they hired 12 officers to help on the case, but just before January 1957, they hired 9 more officers. The leader of the special force was Lieutenant Samuel Roan. In response to this increased violence, liquor store operators started arming themselves and bringing dogs to work as protection. They also changed their operating hours, closing at 8 p.m. instead of 11 p.m. to make themselves less vulnerable. On December 21st, 1956, the pair entered a grocery store in Coventry, Connecticut, belonging to Arthur Vinton, 64, and his 62-year-old wife, while the couple's 3-year-old granddaughter Lori was with them. The two men pistol-whipped Vinton and his wife, but they didn't shoot them. Joseph then ordered Arthur to kill the 3-year-old Lori, but he was hesitant to do that, so he allegedly took her to a different part of the store and told her to be quiet, even shooting his gun into the floor to make Joseph think he killed her. The two men made off with $100 from the Vinton store, and by January 7, 1957, the Vintons provided police with a description of the suspects, stating both men stood over 6 foot and had dark-colored hair. On December 26, 1956, between 8:15 and 8:30 p.m., the pair entered a liquor store in East Hartford and shot the owner, 65-year-old Samuel Cohn, twice in the head, killing him. They then emptied the cash register and left the drawer open. They also rifled through his pockets and stole the money that was in them. A customer later discovered his body lying behind a counter. Even though there were no witnesses, and neighbors to Cohn's store didn't see or hear anything amiss, police immediately connected the crime to the murders of Kurpiewski and Janowski due to the similar way the killers rifled through the victims' cash registers and pockets, shot the victims in the head, and fled the scene without leaving additional evidence. After the murder, East Hartford Mayor John Torpy posted a $1,000 reward for information leading to the capture of Cohn's killer. On January 5, 1957, the pair robbed a shoe store in North Haven. They forced the store's owner, 44-year-old Frank Adonolfi, into a back room while Arthur pistol whipped him. Believing he was dead, they then stole $62 combined from the cash register and his wallet. They also attacked 48-year-old Bernard Spire and his 45-year-old wife Ruth, who were customers in the store and witnesses to the beating. They were robbed of an unknown amount of money before being forced to kneel on the floor. The couple were both fatally shot in the back of the head with a .38 caliber pistol. Although Frank was severely injured and left for dead, he survived the attack and told police upon entering the store the taller man had asked for a size 12 shoe. Upon a lengthy review of prison records, authorities noted that Joseph wore the same size. Police showed Frank a photograph of the assailants, and he identified Arthur as the man who pistol whipped him. On January 26 at approximately 9 p.m., the pair robbed Rosenthal's drugstore, owned by 69-year-old John M. Rosenthal in Hartford, while his son Henry was working in the basement. Joseph shot him twice in the chest with a 9mm Luger pistol and left him to die. After Henry heard the gunshots, he emerged from the basement and witnessed Joseph standing by the cash register. Henry threw a medicine bottle at him, and he was promptly shot at, but the bullet missed and went into a wall instead. Joseph then ran out the door and fled to a getaway car, which Henry observed to be a dark-colored Studebaker, with a companion driving away. Henry provided police with a description of the shooter, saying the man was tall and 30 to 40 years old, had dark hair, and wore an overcoat. Also based on the evidence Aldonifi provided investigators, police arrested the pair on February 23, 1957, charging them with breach of the peace pending the results of a full murder investigation. They also suspected that the two men were responsible for a couple murders in New York as well. Authorities deliberately housed the two separately, with Joseph placed in the Hartford County Jail and Arthur in the police barracks. On February 27th, Arthur confessed to participating in 8 robberies and 6 murders. He led investigators to the murder weapon that was used to kill Kurpiewski and Janowski, which they raked out of a shallow pond. In Arthur's initial confession, he said Joseph fired all the fatal shots and that he only pistol whipped the victims and drove the getaway cars. According to investigators, Arthur possessed an uncanny memory of details when confessing to the crimes and gave them a tour of the various crime scenes and locations where he and Joseph had abandoned weapons. While Joseph refused to speak about anything at first, guards at the Hartford County Jail said that he learned about Arthur's confession through reading a newspaper, and he was surprised to find out how detailed he was. On March 1st, Lieutenant Rome encouraged Joseph's mother to speak to him while the conversation was recorded. Joseph then confessed to the murders of Kurpiewski and Janowski, along with the rest of the murders along the spree, as well as the 1950 murder of Louis Wolfson. Authorities stated that Joseph's confession largely corroborated that of Arthur's, although there were some minor discrepancies. Later, Joseph said that he liked shooting his victims in the head because he was under the belief that gunshot wounds to the head would strip bullets of identifying ballistics evidence. Altogether, the robberies during the killing spree netted the pair less than $400, or about $4,700 in today's money. Following his confession to Wolfson's murder, Wolfson's widow criticized state officials for releasing him. God help those poor families for what they got to go through. Why? Why did they let Taborsky go? She also stated that negative comments directed towards her family in Hartford during Joseph's first imprisonment on death row made her family feel like criminals and encouraged her to move from Hartford to Brooklyn. Wolfson's surviving brother and sister also expressed their disappointment at Joseph's 1955 release, saying that while his confession took away every shadow of a doubt, they also felt sorry for all those other families that had to go through what we did. After both men issued their confessions, a 46-year-old pawnbroker from Hartford was arrested and charged with selling Arthur 7 pistols, as at least 3 were used during the murder spree. The two men jointly went to trial in May 1957. The state only tried them for the murders of Kurpiewski and Janowski. Arthur's attorney attempted to use his mental disabilities to convince the jury to vote against the death penalty for his client, stating, "I can't believe that any American jury will return a first-degree verdict and send Arthur Culombe to the electric chair." Joseph's defense attorney tried to argue that the murder spree was partly in retribution due to the 4 years he spent on death row, noting that he told a prison psychiatrist, "When I killed another human being, they didn't think it was wrong when they wanted to kill me." What? Another one of his attorneys tried to say that he had a lifelong mental illness that rendered him unable to differentiate between right and wrong. A psychiatrist hired by the defense stated Joseph's motive for committing murder against his robbery victims was to convince the state to execute him, and that he was therefore a psychotic who was unable to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Dr. Harold Bancroft, a psychiatrist testifying for the prosecution, disputed the notion that his motive was indicative of psychosis, saying that he robbed people due to his desire for money and killed them to eliminate witnesses. Dr. Bancroft also disputed the defense's argument that his initial 4-year stint on death row played a role in the murders. Observers at the trial said Joseph laughed at gruesome evidence and made some threatening gestures towards trial attendees. At the time, Taborsky and Colombe's murder trial was the longest in Connecticut's history, with jury selection taking 5 weeks and other trial proceedings taking another 5 weeks. The trials ended on June 27, 1957, when the jury convicted both men of first-degree murder, sentencing them both to death. Following their convictions, the Hartford Courant published an article in support of the death penalty, reading, "If ever capital punishment is used, it is justified for these two." While on death row for the second time, Joseph attempted suicide twice in 1959, but attempts were stopped by the guards. He then advocated for the death penalty against himself, writing to Governor Ribicoff in a letter, "It is more humane to kill a convict than to make him suffer years of imprisonment." The Connecticut Supreme Court upheld both men's death sentences in March 1960, with both of their executions being scheduled for May 17th. Joseph waived all remaining appeals and rejected an opportunity for a plea of clemency to the Board of Pardons, so he was considered an execution volunteer. Joseph's sentence was carried out shortly after 10:30 p.m. on May 17th. Arthur, however, continued to fight his death sentence and got his appeals to the federal level, thus postponing his execution date the week before he was scheduled to die. On June 19, 1961, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned his conviction based on an argument in his appeal that police violated his constitutional rights by using aggressive tactics during his initial interrogation, in addition to investigators questioning him for 4 days without an attorney present. Due to the nature of his appeal and overturned conviction, Connecticut officials believed it would be hard to obtain another first-degree murder conviction, so they offered him a plea deal for second-degree murder, and he accepted, thereby taking the death penalty off the table. Arthur was officially resentenced to life imprisonment on June 30, 1961. In 1969, he unsuccessfully petitioned the courts to apply 4 years and 4 months of time served to his life sentence so his parole date would come sooner. Arthur petitioned for his freedom again in 1970, but the State Board of Pardons rejected his petition because inmates under life sentences needed to serve at least 20 years before the board would consider them for parole. Arthur died in prison on December 22, 1970 at the age of 46, as officials determined that he died of natural causes. The Mad Dog killings had a long-lasting effect on Connecticut citizens. The crimes also had a significant effect on Connecticut's death penalty, which was waning in popularity shortly before the spree took place. Prior to the murders, the Hartford Courant published an editorial series calling for the end to capital punishment in Connecticut. Also in 1955, Governor Ribicoff stated his opposition to the death penalty and called for its abolition, announcing his intent to sign such legislation if the state would pass the bill, but they declined to do so before the killing spree began. Shortly before the arrest of Taborsky and Culombe, Governor Ribicoff announced his support for the death penalty in their case, while the Hartford Courant published a follow-up editorial in which they too reversed their previous position, saying, "Capital punishment is not a deterrent, it is not a punishment, but in certain situations, it's like putting out a fire or killing a mad dog." Lewis Wolfson's widow, who moved her family out of Connecticut after her husband's murder, criticized death penalty abolitionists after the killer's arrest, saying, "How does it feel to know that you and others like you helped a man commit more murders when you could have stopped him after the first?" Thank you guys. I really appreciate y'all for the support. Man, leave a like if you enjoyed. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to my channel. Thank you. Please be safe and the grind. I'm out. Peace.
It started really in 1956. There was a series of murders occurred, which terrorized the state of Connecticut. The papers were filled with the Mad Dog killers.
And they'd just walk in, pull out a gun, and say, "This is a stick-up." And always, before they went for the money, they would pistol whip or blackjack or just shoot the victim. And any customer that happened to be there would go down with them.
They were usually the owners of small convenience stores or gas stations or liquor stores.
Storekeepers were arming themselves with guns or getting dogs or locking the doors. They wouldn't let anybody in except a customer they knew. And this fear that people had mounted with each new killing, all random. You never know where they were going to strike next. It started here at this gas station on Stanley Street in New Britain. This was the first of a series of murders which occurred during the next several months, in which they killed a total of 7 people, netted about $308, I think it was, that they got out of all these robberies. But in addition to the 7 that they killed, they left a wake of probably another 7 or 8 people who they pistol whipped and blackjacked and left for dead after firing a bullet at them.